Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever walked away from someone who thought you'd always be there, only to realize your silence spoke louder than any goodbye? Today, let's dive into the topic of how your absence can become your greatest power. If you've ever felt undervalued, overlooked, or like your worth was only seen when you stopped showing up, this one's for you. You're not here to beg for love, you're here to remember who you are. If you're ready to reclaim your energy and master the art of self-respect, hit that subscribe button, because your next chapter starts now. Silence isn't always about making a statement to others. Sometimes it's the only way to make a promise to yourself. When you decide to stop speaking, stop reaching out and stop explaining your worth, you're doing more than just walking away. You're reclaiming your voice by choosing not to use it where it isn't valued. There is strength in restraint, in choosing not to fill the space with questions, pleas, or reminders of what you offered. That silence doesn't come from weakness, but from the deepest part of self-awarenessness. It's the part of you that knows begging for a place in someone's life is a betrayal of your own dignity. When someone doesn't see you, you don't dim your light to gain their attention. You walk back into your own spotlight. The silence that follows isn't a punishment for them, it's protection for you. It's the sacred pause where healing begins and clarity rises from the quiet. You learn more about who you are in that stillness than you ever could through noise. There is often a misconception that if you just explain a little more, if you just say the right thing, you might finally be heard. But when someone's mind is made up, words become echoes. Loud, but powerless. The desire to be understood is valid, but there's a point when expressing yourself turns into performing for approval. That's where silence becomes your armor. Not the cold, calculated silence of manipulation, but the calm, grounded quiet of self-respect. It's the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be chased or noticed. It simply exists, radiating confidence that doesn't need validation, because real strength isn't in how loud you can be. It's in how gracefully you can choose not to speak when speaking will cost you your peace. Silence teaches you that you don't need to explain why you're worthy. You simply are, and those who recognize that don't need convincing. The beautiful thing about silence is that it gives you space to hear yourself again. When you stop responding, stop reacting, stop trying to fix things that were never yours to fix, you begin to come home to yourself. You start to remember how much you gave, how much you compromised, how often you minimized your needs just to hold on to something uncertain. And in the quiet, you stop romanticizing what was never stable. You stop editing the story to make it seem like it was better than it truly was. That silence becomes a mirror. And in it, you finally see the truth that you were worthy the entire time, that nothing you did wrong made them leave, and nothing more you said would have made them stay. You don't fill silence anymore just to feel less alone. You learn to sit in it until it turns into peace. Choosing silence is not about pretending you don't care. It's about proving to yourself that your care should have limits. Boundaries allowed, even when they're silent. And this particular silence says, I will no longer participate in my own disrespect. It says you are no longer willing to make excuses for being sidelined, misunderstood, or half chosen. It's not about cutting someone off in bitterness. It's about cutting yourself free from the grip of waiting for a change, waiting for clarity, waiting for someone else's decision to dictate your worth. When you go quiet, you stop outsourcing your value. You stop measuring your importance based on how someone else responds to you. That decision is the beginning of emotional freedom. The beginning of becoming your own source of validation, of worth, of love. The hardest part is often right after you stop speaking, when the silence feels like absence, when you wonder if maybe one more message, one more call might fix it. But healing doesn't live in the repetition of rejection. It lives in the moments where you stay still long enough to feel the ache and let it pass. That ache isn't a sign to go back. It's proof you're moving through something that once defined you. Every second you don't break the silence, you build resilience. Not because you're trying to be strong for anyone else, but because you're learning to sit with discomfort without abandoning yourself. You don't escape pain by clinging to someone. You face it by holding your own hand through the silence. It's a sacred discomfort, but one that reshapes you into someone who no longer begs to be chosen. In that silence, something magical happens. You begin to hear your own unmet needs more clearly. You realize how long you've been starving for real emotional reciprocity. How long you've been satisfied with crumbs because they felt better than nothing. And now that you've stepped back, now that you've unplugged from the performance of being enough, you start to see what enough really means. It's not about being more likable or more available. It's about being aligned with people who meet you where you are, not who you have to chase. Silence strips away the illusions and leaves only the truth. And the truth is, your peace was never meant to be the price for connection. Real love won't require that silence as a strategy. It will come after you've made peace, with the kind of silence that heals instead of hides. Your silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of power. Every time you choose not to respond to something that disrespects your value, you reinforce your worth to yourself. You become the person who no longer negotiates for the bare minimum. That doesn't mean you don't feel, well, of course you do, but you're learning to feel without reacting, to hold space for your emotions without letting them drag you back into patterns that keep you stuck. This is what emotional maturity looks like. It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. It's choosing peace over proving, self-worth over short-term validation. And that quiet courage speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Eventually, the silence shifts. What once felt like a void starts to feel like protection. You realize that what you thought was rejection was actually redirection. That you were never truly being pushed away. You were being released to rise. You don't owe anyone a speech about how they hurt you. You don't need a final conversation to gain closure, because closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you give yourself when you choose to stop asking for clarity from someone who thrives in confusion. And silence, chosen with intention, becomes the loudest form of closure there is. Not because it punishes, but because it ends the cycle. And so you continue in the silence, not because you're afraid to speak, but because you've finally learned that not everyone deserves access to your voice. Not every situation is worthy of your energy. Not every connection is meant to be fought for. That realization doesn't harden you, it liberates you. You become softer with yourself, even if you become quieter with others. You start showing up in your own life with the love and consistency you were waiting for. And in that, your silence becomes a sanctuary, a place where healing happens, where growth begins, and where you start to rise, not in spite of being unheard, but because you finally heard yourself. Sometimes people expect you to stay tethered to them, even after they've let you go. They believe that by pushing you away, you'll orbit just close enough to catch again if they change their mind. That's the unspoken dynamic many rely on. The assumption that rejection won't really end things, it'll just tilt the balance of power. But the moment you choose to disappear without a trace, everything shifts. You don't plead, you don't protest, you don't try to explain. You simply walk. And in doing so, you violate every expectation they had about your behavior. What they anticipated was a chase, what they receive was silence. That disruption is louder than any words you could have said. It rewrites the script they thought they knew. Walking away without resistance creates confusion in someone used to being pursued. There's a rhythm people get used to. They push, you pull. They withdraw, you lean in. But when that pattern is broken, it forces them to sit in uncertainty. They don't know if you'll come back, and more importantly, they don't know why you didn't stay. That mystery is unsettling, because it implies something they don't want to believe. That you have more self-worth than they expected. That your identity isn't built around convincing someone to choose you. And once they lose control of the narrative, they start to feel the consequences of your absence. You stop being predictable. You stop being available. And that unpredictability is powerful. You weren't supposed to be the one to end the story. You weren't supposed to accept the rejection quietly and just vanish. Because people don't often walk away with grace. They argue, they justify, they look for cracks they can slip through to stay relevant. But when you don't do that, it sends a different kind of message, not one of bitterness, but of inner peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing that not all battles are worth fighting. When someone removes themselves from your life, the most dignified response isn't resistance, it's release. And letting go silently isn't passive, it's intentional. It says you value your time, your energy, and your future more than you value fixing something one-sided. That's not cruelty, that's clarity. There's a quiet power in becoming the person who doesn't return once dismissed, not out of pride, but out of purpose. You've learned that your emotional energy is sacred, and it shouldn't be poured into places that leak. Walking away without drama signals growth. It shows that you've stopped needing to prove your worth through struggle, that you're done equating pain with passion. The truth is, people expect you to need closure, to crave one last conversation, but some stories don't deserve sequels. And when you walk without asking for permission or explanation, it challenges the belief that you needed them to begin with. That challenge creates a ripple. They begin to question their assumptions, their choices, and what your silence really means. You become a mirror, whether you intend to or not. Your departure reflects back to them something they may not be ready to see, the reality that not everyone will stick around after being treated as temporary. That realization can be jarring, especially when it comes from someone they underestimate. When someone expects you to chase and you don't, it forces them to reflect. They might not show it, they might even pretend they're unaffected, but silence creates space. And in that space, thoughts echo louder. Regret, doubt, reconsideration, they all start to bubble up because the one they expected to chase is now nowhere to be found. And that absence creates an emotional vacuum that words can't fill. Being the one who walks away without noise is often misread as being cold or uncaring. But what it really means is that you've made peace with being misunderstood. You've decided that being seen clearly is less important than protecting your energy. You don't need to be the villain in anyone's story or the martyr in your own. You're just done participating in dynamics that devalue your presence. And the moment you stop engaging, you remove the fuel that keeps those dynamics alive. You no longer explain, defend, or chase. You just exit. And that exit is powerful because it's not about making them miss you. It's about choosing not to miss yourself in the process of trying to be chosen. Your silence becomes the unspoken proof that you're no longer emotionally available to people who aren't emotionally invested. It's a line drawn, not with anger, but with certainty. And even though it might feel unnatural at first, not rushing to fix, not rushing to prove, it becomes your new baseline. You start to notice how much lighter you feel when you stop seeking from those who can't give. How much more peace you have when you stop trying to earn love from someone who made you feel like a backup plan. Walking away rewires your self-worth. You realize that real connection doesn't require convincing, that the right people don't need to be shocked into noticing you. They already see you. What makes your silence so powerful is that it doesn't scream for attention, it commands it. Not by force, but by contrast. Because in a world that thrives on noise, on reaction, on emotional chaos, your lack of response becomes the loudest part of the story. It becomes the part that gets remembered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was definitive. You teach others how to treat you by what you tolerate. And when you tolerate nothing less than mutual respect, people feel that. They sense that your peace is no longer up for negotiation, that you won't lose yourself in trying to win someone else. That's what sets you apart, not your silence alone, but the strength beneath it. Eventually, those who expected you to linger will have to confront the fact that you're not waiting anymore. That you're not checking in, not watching their moves, not hoping for their attention. You've redirected your energy inward. You've invested in healing, in growth, in rediscovering joy without attachment to someone else's validation. And that self-investment creates a glow no rejection can dim. It's not about proving anything to anyone else. It's about no longer needing to. You've stepped into a version of yourself that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, and doesn't settle. And in doing so, you've become the one who surprises, the one they remember, not for how loudly you fought to stay, but for how gracefully you chose to leave. Silence is often mistaken for surrender, but more often, it's a strategy of clarity. In a world that constantly demands explanations and reactions, silence stands out as a moment of intentional stillness. When you stop speaking, not out of fear or confusion, but from calm certainty, you create space for yourself and for others. That space becomes a mirror. In that mirror, people are left alone with their thoughts, their actions, and their consequences. And it's in that space that they begin to feel what they tried to avoid. Without your voice filling the silence, they are forced to hear their own. Without your presence bridging the distance, they are left to cross the space they created. Silence isn't emptiness. It's a container for reflection. And that reflection often speaks louder than any confrontation. Choosing not to speak isn't avoidance. It's a boundary. It's a pause that says, I've said enough. Now it's your turn to sit with what remains. The absence of response removes the safety net of constant reassurance. It pulls back the comfort of being forgiven without effort, understood without accountability, and desired without reciprocation. That's where discomfort begins to surface. Not because you shouted, but because you didn't. Not because you pushed, but because you withdrew. And in that vacuum, truths begin to reveal themselves. You stop being the one chasing peace and instead become the one creating it. Your silence, once mistaken for passivity, becomes the most active part of the connection. It forces reflection, not through confrontation, but through contrast. There's a shift that happens when you stop explaining yourself to those who don't listen. Your silence breaks a pattern they didn't even know they relied on. Every message you didn't send, every call you didn't make becomes a statement of self-respect. Not every situation needs closure through words. Sometimes closure comes from the decision to stop engaging. When someone no longer hears from you, they start to hear from themselves. They replay conversations. They fill in the blanks. They ask themselves questions you used to answer for them. And now that the answers aren't being given, they must go inward. Silence becomes the space where responsibility can no longer be outsourced. It becomes a teacher, a revealer, a pressure point for realization. People don't reflect when you're always available. They don't change when they know you'll cushion every consequence. They reflect when the echoes of your absence become louder than the noise of their distractions. Silence isn't manipulation, it's discipline. It says, I'm no longer willing to do the emotional labor for you. And when that labor stops, something begins to shift. The weight of their choices starts to settle in ways it never could when you were always ready to fix or explain. Your quiet presence, or lack thereof, becomes a catalyst. They are left to deal with the reality of a world where you're no longer cushioning the fall. And often, that's when true awareness begins. When you no longer feel the silence, they begin to feel the gravity of what's missing. Not because you tried to make them miss you, but because your energy was never ordinary. When someone has grown used to you always being there, your absence disrupts their rhythm. They go looking for the comfort they once took for granted, and in its place, they find stillness. That stillness is where introspection happens. Not all at once, and not always immediately, but eventually. When you stop showing up the way you used to, it forces a reckoning. The brain starts to trace back the last moments, looking for answers in the quiet. The heart starts to wonder why the warmth is no longer there. That wondering is the beginning of realization. Silence removes the noise that distracts from growth. It eliminates the easy out of blaming others, the temptation to deflect, and the illusion of control. When you withdraw your energy, it creates a kind of tension that can't be ignored. And in that tension, people are left to sit with themselves. It's there that accountability takes root. When your words are no longer available to soften the truth begins to harden into lesson. Not every lesson comes from dialogue. Some come from the absence of it. Your silence gives space for the consequences to breathe, to settle, to teach. And while it may seem like nothing is happening, everything is, because in the absence of your voice, theirs finally becomes loud enough to hear. It's not your job to force someone to reflect. It's your responsibility to protect your peace. And often, protecting your peace looks like walking away quietly, without drama or bitterness. It's a decision, not a reaction. It's rooted in the understanding that people grow not just from being heard, but from not being heard anymore. When someone has had repeated access to your time, your heart, and your compassion, and suddenly that access is gone, it creates a powerful silence. That silence is fertile ground for change, if they're willing to sit with it. And if they're not, then at least you've made space for your own growth. Either way, someone is learning something in that stillness. Either way, the silence is doing the work. Silence is the language of high value. It says, I won't compete for what should be clear. I won't argue to be seen. I won't shout to be chosen. And when you operate from that place, your energy shifts. You start to see that not everyone deserves a front row seat to your life. That not every connection is worth preserving through explanation. Sometimes it's the quietest exits that leave the deepest impressions. Not because they were calculated, but because they were rooted in truth. Truth doesn't need to yell. Truth doesn't need to plead. It simply is. And your silence, anchored in self-respect, becomes undeniable. It forces others to confront what they lost, not through words, but through the absence of them. In the end, the silence that follows your withdrawal isn't just a void, it's a boundary. It's a declaration that says, this is where I stop and you begin. And in that space, people are left to decide what they'll do with the version of you that is no longer holding the weight of both sides. They can ignore it, pretend it doesn't matter, or they can finally start to see. But the beauty of silence is that it doesn't demand either outcome. It doesn't hinge on being noticed. It simply exists as proof that you've chosen growth over noise, that you've chosen your peace over your pattern. And that choice, though quiet, changes everything. There comes a moment when you realize that closure is not something you wait for. It's something you claim. It doesn't arrive in a neatly wrapped conversation, a well-timed apology, or the perfect explanation. Sometimes it comes in the quiet decision to stop needing anything more. You stop replaying the story, stop dissecting every word, stop hoping they'll finally understand. Instead, you begin to understand yourself. That's when your silence becomes something different. Not a waiting room for someone else's clarity, but a sanctuary for your own. You no longer need answers from outside, because the peace you're building within is stronger than the chaos they left behind. You become your own closure, one breath, one boundary, one step at a time. There's a certain strength in no longer needing to be heard to feel seen. You've spent so much energy trying to be understood, thinking that maybe if you explained your side just right, everything would change. But eventually you grow tired of shouting into silence. You grow tired of shrinking just to be digestible to someone who was never truly listening. So you stop. You stop speaking, not out of defeat, but out of self-respect. Your silence becomes a full sentence. It says everything that doesn't need to be said. It says you're done making a case for your worth, that you no longer seek resolution in the same place you lost your peace. Letting go doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you cared enough to know that holding on would keep wounding you. People romanticize endurance as proof of love, but sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to end the story mid-sentence and walk away. That takes more courage than staying in a cycle that keeps breaking you. You don't need to bleed to prove your loyalty. You don't need to explain your silence. The quiet itself is a declaration. You've chosen yourself, and that choice doesn't require validation. It's not cold. It's not heartless. It's just finally rooted in truth. And truth doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with solitude, and that's okay. In the stillness, after everything falls apart, you find the most honest parts of yourself, no longer tangled in proving, fixing, or waiting. You start to listen to the version of you that has been whispering all along. The one who said, "You deserve more." The one who asked, "Why do you keep staying where love feels like uncertainty?" That voice gets louder in the silence, and you begin to realize how much noise you tolerated just to avoid being alone. But now that you're here, in this space, without distractions, you're starting to feel something new. Peace. Not because you got what you wanted, but because you finally stopped trying to get it from someone who couldn't give it. You used to think healing would come when they finally saw your worth. But now you understand that healing begins the moment you see it for yourself. It's a quiet awakening, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a slow, steady return to your own center. It happens when you stop reaching and start resting. When you no longer base your value on who stays or leaves. When your heart stops chasing and starts remembering what it feels like to be whole without someone else's approval. That's where healing lives, in the decision to stop performing, in the bravery to sit in the silence and let it cleanse everything that was never meant to stay. Healing isn't loud, it's gentle, and it starts with you. People expect a reaction. They expect noise, a scene, a dramatic ending. But you're not giving them that, you're giving them distance, which is far more powerful. Not to hurt, not to prove a point, but to protect your spirit. You've realized that not everyone deserves a front row seat to your vulnerability. That some goodbyes don't need to be announced, they just need to happen. And that your growth isn't a performance. It's not meant to be witnessed or validated by the person who didn't protect what you offered. Sometimes your greatest transformation happens behind closed doors, in the quiet, with no one watching. And that's enough. Because it's real. The silence isn't just about ending something. It's about beginning something too. A new relationship with yourself. A new chapter that doesn't revolve around being chosen, but about choosing. Choosing peace over chaos. Choosing boundaries over exhaustion. Choosing depth over attention. The kind of beginning that doesn't rush, doesn't force, doesn't need to be justified. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that bends to keep them comfortable. In this new space, your energy becomes sacred, your time becomes intentional, your heart becomes yours again. And in that beginning, you build a foundation so solid, nothing that shakes you will ever be able to break you again. There will be moments when the silence feels heavy, when you're tempted to reach out, to fill the space, to just say something. But then you remember all the times your voice went unheard, all the times you overextended just to be met with indifference. And you breathe. You sit in that silence, not as punishment, but as proof of growth. You've outgrown the need to convince someone to see your light. You've stopped asking for the love that requires you to abandon yourself. And in that moment, when you choose silence again, you realize how far you've come. The temptation fades, and what's left is peace. Not the peace that comes from answers, but the peace that comes from release. Eventually, what once felt like loss becomes liberation. You no longer carry the weight of unanswered questions. You no longer need to revisit every memory for meaning. The past stops feeling like a wound and starts becoming a lesson, one you no longer have to repeat. And the silence that once felt empty now feels full of possibility, of strength, of self. You realize that nothing truly valuable will require you to beg for clarity, that love, respect, and connection aren't earned through suffering. They're recognized effortlessly when they're real. So now you walk differently. You love differently. You protect your energy with a grace that only comes from choosing to heal without permission. By staying silent, you've reclaimed something powerful, your choice. The choice not to participate in what drains you. The choice not to shrink for someone else's comfort. The choice to rise without noise, to grow without spectacle, to let go without fanfare. That is the ultimate form of self-love. It doesn't seek revenge. It doesn't seek approval. It just seeks truth. And once you've tasted the kind of peace that silence brings, you'll never chase chaos again. You'll know that some closures are loud, but the most powerful ones are quiet. And in that quiet, you are free.